Now, if we were meeting as a class together in a classroom, what we would do now is we would break into small groups, and together we would consider the philosophical approaches to some contemporary issues about animal and environmental ethics. Now, I have identified a few here. Under animal ethics, we could look at medical experimentation, testing cosmetics, eating meat, animal farming. Under environmental ethics, we could consider things like nuclear power, toxic waste, or pollution regulations. And then we can consider how a utilitarian or a Kantian would argue for or against these types of things. Let me just provide a little bit of, I guess, context for what some of these things are. Medical experimentation, right? Many times scientists will do experimentation on animals prior to testing on humans. This is actually, it's similar but different. I remember when I was traveling in southern Utah, just outside of Zion's National Park, there's an area where NASA used to do experimentations, trying to get a sense of what it would be like for human beings to re-enter the atmosphere, and to try to get a sense to study how gravity and would impact right the human body. And to do this, NASA tested with monkeys. So what they would do, I kid you not, they would take monkeys and they would launch them off the side of a cliff. And they would strap them into parachutes, into other type of equipment that NASA was experimenting with, and just see what would happen. And so this is maybe more scientific experimentation, but I think I think maybe even symbolically it works. Right? We often test on animals before we test on humans, and what that means, at least from an ethical perspective, is that we value the human life more than we value the animal life. And it suggests that these animals don't have the same level of rights as human beings. So how would utilitarians argue about this? So for medical experimentation, for utilitarians, this raises the problem of knowing consequences. How do we balance certain harm to animals against possible benefits to humans as well as non-humans? Further down, utilitarians would also have an interesting perspective on eating meat. Right? Does eating meat raise questions about how we measure pleasure and pain? One cow can produce 300 hamburgers, plus hundreds of pounds of steaks, roasts, etc. Does the pleasure enjoyed by meat-eating human beings offset the pain suffered by the cow? For Kantians, especially those who follow the Tom Regan variety, one might wonder whether his conclusions are too strong. On his view, no animal testing is ever justified, and animal farming is morally impermissible. For both invoke treating animals as mere things. Now, is this an implication we can live with? All right? Does this, and I know there's many people in communities who are moving, especially in the food choices, towards farm fresh, right? Eating eggs that come from chickens that are free range, right? Arguing that they have a better, healthier lifestyle, and that this is then passed on into the food. It's just far healthier than a bird that is forced to be cannibalistic and live in a small cage and is used primarily as a means to an end. For Kantians of the Carl Cohen variety, who I mentioned in my last video, problems are raised by the so-called marginal cases. If non-humans are excluded from the moral community and hence do not have rights because they are not rational, then what is implied about infant humans or adults in reversible comas, right, who also are not rational, who also cannot think for themselves? If these animals do not have rights primarily because they are not rational, then what about humans who lack the ability to reason? Do they also not have rights? Now, let me note, though, that Cohen's view is not explicitly discussed. This problem is raised for Kantians who seek to construct a hierarchy of dignity, right? The dignity of one being is higher than another. Moving down to environmental ethics, perhaps the most important point to underscore for utilitarians here is that all persons' interests count and count equally. We talked about egalitarian. As noted above, this includes the interests of persons who do not yet exist. So for Kantians, questions about what it means to respect the dignity of persons take center stage. So many of you may be unfamiliar with the Nimbyism, N-I-M-B-Y, or it's an acronym, stands for not in my backyard. So not in my backyard approach to disposing of waste, which enables the wealthy and hence politically powerful to avoid having to deal with waste produced in a consumer society, and thus often placing a disproportionate burden upon the poor. Right. So as we think about this, we can certainly consider the ethics. I know that much toxic waste is not buried in sites in the East Coast, but are taken to the mountains of Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, into area where there's not as many humans, and burying those deep there. Now, while arguably safe, in the moment when it's no longer safe, the people who will be impacted are those of these states who are in need of the financial benefits that come from housing the toxic waste.